All right, let's go ahead and get started for today's session. So we are on our very last webinar for housing. And so today we're going to talk about housing before and after disasters. So one of the things to consider about housing when you think about it, especially in areas that are prone to disasters, is that half the population of an urban area, and this is a quote, lives in inadequate and unsafe housing before disaster. And so after a disaster, it's only imminent that there's going to be some issues with housing afterwards. So after that disaster, which basically means that disaster recovery is basically an overlay of urgent issues on the long-term problem of inadequate housing. Instead of people thinking about it in the moment of, what we need to do is kind of prepare ahead of time and kind of settle these housing issues around their adequacy up front instead of waiting for a disaster to happen and then try to recover from it in that process. But, we are what we are, and that's just going to be the lay of the land until something kind of happened politically and structurally. But with that, we're going to talk about housing preparedness and disaster preparedness in that context. So what does that even really mean? Basically, with people in their houses and being prepared for disasters, there are different types of interactions that can happen around disaster preparedness and housing preparedness. And so basically it can be an infrastructural preparedness. So whether someone is looking to get new shutters and new windows, whether they're looking into getting their home elevated, a new roof, that is one aspect of housing preparedness that can be directed towards. It may be financial. So whether someone has flood insurance, homeowners insurance, rental insurance, actual life insurance, whether they have some personal savings and planning that they want to put in order, or whether they're going to be seeking some governmental assistance after the fact. There's also this systemic or resource preparedness, which is heavily involved in community planning and just kind of knowing where to go if you know you're going to need sheltering, or if you know you're going to need to kind of rely on some additional resources, just making sure you are informed about what resources are out there. And then lastly, basically your social preparedness context. And so if you live in a neighborhood that is easily flooded or easily impacted by different types of disasters, just making sure your neighborhood has a plan around maybe who to go to and what phone tree to use around alarming people, and just making communication very clear around your neighborhood. And so to be clear, a lot of these things are very, very much so intersectional. And so when your clients come to you about topics around housing and like how to get prepared for storms and whatnot, a lot of the issues they may bring up are going to be a multitude of these types of issues. So a lot of these things interact with one another and are very, very, very much contingent upon a person's situation. So funny, in Louisiana, 42% of homes in high-risk areas are insured through flood insurance, but only 12.5% of homes in middle to low-risk areas are insured. And this is a huge, huge drop. A lot of it may likely have to do with the reallocation or the remapping of like the flood maps and the language they're using around flood insurance. So a lot of times it may mention that, you live in like an X flood zone, and technically when you get your mortgage, you don't have to have flood insurance, but we live in an area that flooding is very likely in very many areas, and the only way to be protected against those barriers is to have flood insurance. So when we talk about flood insurance in New Orleans, or generally in the state of Louisiana, it's important to know that just because someone has a homeowner's insurance, that they may not necessarily have flood insurance. So it's typically not something that's packaged together within your general homeowner's policy. So it's something that you may want to communicate to your clients, that they make sure that they add on a policy for flood-specific insurance. So with that, it does go into effect probably about 30 days after the person has added that policy addition onto their insurance policy. And so if, for example, I'm one of those people, I waited until June to add flood insurance onto my policy because I live in the X zone. So when I purchased my home, I did not have to purchase flood insurance. But because we live in an area that, although it does not flood often, the likelihood if we have a very active hurricane season is likely. So we actually added on flood insurance a little later. So June, and ours will go in effect in July. So basically making sure you have that conversation that if you're interested in flood insurance, understand that it'll be active about 30 days after you purchase the policy. And so flood insurance from a private insurer is very different from FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. We're going to take a look at the website in a little bit, but basically it requires state of emergency and the subsequent presidential declaration of a disaster, basically. And so with that, the state of emergency is often declared in anticipation of requesting FEMA funds. So with flood insurance and having the conversations around flood insurance, it's really important for your clients to kind of do their own research and understand what the market rates are, what are the likelihoods, what does the policy implicate, and just basically understand the terminology and where they are and what their flood risks are, where they live, and any possible discounts that may be affiliated with some of the social and interpersonal demographic groups that they belong to. In addition to that, there are ways for your clients to get in contact with different types of insurance agents around either the National Insurance Program or the State Department of Insurance. And so there are contact numbers here for both of those entities should you want to pass that on to your client. So very quickly, I just want to show you the websites for both the FloodSmart.gov and the Louisiana Department of Insurance. So I'm going to switch here. And so basically, this FloodSmart program, the National Flood Insurance Program that's on FloodSmart.gov, basically gives you an overview of flood insurance and the information that they offer. And so you can choose to either buy or renew your flood insurance. You can look into some research about why you may need flood insurance, understanding where you are. So they actually use the FEMA flood maps to kind of basically tell you which flood zone you're in, and then ways you can possibly reduce your costs. So a lot of times if your home is elevated, your flood insurance rate is going to be a lot lower than someone who does not have their home elevated. And there are other built structural implications that you can use in order to make your house a little bit more stable, but also can lower different types of costs that are associated with your flood policy. In the event that something happens, they walk you through how to file a claim. And also, again, they give you the 800 number for contacting someone to specifically talk about your issues. So it's a pretty hefty site. Again, the National Flood Insurance Program is affiliated with FEMA, but it is a great resource, very much so informative, and it's definitely something that is available to everyone who is out there. And so the Louisiana Department of Insurance also has a website. They understand, of course, a little bit more about our specific issues here in New Orleans and can probably attest to more specific scenarios. But their website, too, is also super informative about how to file different types of claims, filing complaints against different insurance policies if you are having an issue getting your insurance company to pay. They can walk you through that as well and figuring out who's at fault and who may not be at fault. So a bunch of different resources here, but they also have it broken up into whether you are looking for information as a particular client or consumer, or whether you're looking on behalf of a business or residential, commercial property. So as consumers, of course, because we want to focus a bit more on the clients that you guys may serve, we're looking at this type of information. So they have a whole section on flood insurance. And basically they can tell you a little bit about what is common among those who are filing insurance claims on flood insurance, and those different types of places who offer flood insurance. So again, they mentioned the National Flood Insurance Program here, and they have a bunch of different resources that you can look into, and just a brief overview about why it's important to basically have flood insurance. Because again, flood insurance is not something that is built into a homeowner's insurance policy. It is an additional policy that works in conjunction with your homeowner's policy. And so something that I thought was pretty cool was they have a frequently asked questions list about flood insurance. And so this may be something that you can share with your clients if they're interested over there, if they open up the conversation around purchasing flood insurance. This may be something that is of use, definitely not required. But another tool that was not mentioned on the slide, but I definitely think is worth bringing up, is that NOLA.gov has basically put in this Ready for Rain tool. And so basically Ready for Rain allows you to figure out what your risk is as far as flooding. And it gives you additional information and steps around what you can do in order to prepare yourself in the case of flooding. So just to test it out, we're gonna put in my work address here at LSU. So we're at Bolivar Street, boop. And it basically tells me that my flood risk is high. So this property is a zone based on the Federal Emergency Management Agency's flood insurance MAP rate. And so it tells me I live in a low lying area and it often has rainy climate, and because my building is not necessarily elevated above the ground at 3 feet, sure. So they give you all the information you need to know about where you live and the structure in which you live, and then some things you can do to lower your risk. So clearly I can't do anything necessarily about where I live if I live here, but here are some things that I can do to minimize my flooding risk. And so that includes cleaning out catch basins, elevating your utilities if that is an option, installing green infrastructure to kind of alleviate some of that standing water, and then to, of course, elevate your home. Now, some of these things do require additional money. So when you're talking about that planning conversation around, or going back to that housing preparedness slide we had previously around the different types of preparedness there are, whether it's infrastructure or financial, this is one of those situations where it's a culmination of many. Elevating your home isn't something that's necessarily optional for most people because it costs a lot of money. But should you be in a situation where you have that option, sure, go for it. But there are just a few ways here to kind of minimize your risk when it comes to flooding. And then as far as flood insurance is concerned, it tells you what your flood insurance likelihood should be. So in this case, it is highly recommended that I have flood insurance because I am in a very risky flood zone. And so, of course, they go into some information around flood insurance being required in certain situations, and the amount that you can potentially save if you have flood insurance. So one of the things that a lot of people bring up is that, oh, my home is worth this amount, and I'm insured for this amount. But again, if you don't have that flood insurance policy, that dwelling amount that you're financed for or insured for is not legal because you don't have the flood insurance to protect that dwelling amount. So they're saying that the average cost in this particular zone is $1,100 a year. And then for those who are insured, they got 7 times more from flood insurance payouts. So again, another tool for you all to use with your clients. And this is ready.nola.gov/rain. So super cool tool, relatively new. It's definitely worth playing around with because a lot of these links are interactive. So you can read a little bit more about that stuff. So switch it back to our PowerPoint. So moving on, again, if someone is in a situation where they do actually need to start a flood claim on their policy, it is super, super important to kind of be prepared before that fact. So of course, everything we're talking about is in preparedness for disaster. So great things to do ahead of the flood claim, of course, is having your policy somewhere where you can access it, but also somewhere that it would not get damaged. So what I've recently heard from the Louisiana Department of Insurance is to put your policy basically in like a gallon Ziploc bag and store it somewhere that's easily accessible so that in the event of flooding, you can access your policy, and it's also protected from getting wet or getting damaged, so that you can go back and reread through what your policy basically covers you for, and you can have that information readily available. It is also a good idea to take pictures of your home before the event, because a lot of times when you file a claim and you're like, oh, well, I had like a 70-inch TV and like a California king bed and all these extra things that cannot necessarily be accounted for after the fact. And so just taking pictures of your property, taking pictures of some of the rooms in your home, and having the date marked. So maybe putting up a newspaper within the photo to show what the date is, to make sure that it's validated. So just having that information prepared before your claim. The rest is pretty much very logistic. Filing a claim, you can do that electronically. You can do that over the phone with your insurance policy, and making sure you know who your insurer is. Preparing for your inspection, and then working out the adjustments and documenting your loss and receiving payment. So again, to reiterate, keeping paper copies of your information. Of course, most of the policies now, they email you a copy of the declaration and everything, but in the event that something happens and electronic devices may not be accessible, or Wi-Fi may not be accessible, having paper copies is a fantastic idea. If you're super against it for saving the trees, just get a thumb drive and just have it somewhere protected. That way you can access it after the fact. So HUD has a few toolkits or has a resourceful website that houses a bunch of different types of resources within a toolkit. So the HUD Housing Counseling Disaster Planning Response and Recovery Toolkit. It's available on the website. And again, we're going to go through it in a little bit together, but it's very much so thorough. It has a bunch of different information around preparing your specific organization for immediate disasters within an emergency response plan, in addition to preparing your organization to open after a disaster by developing a continuity of operations plan. Additionally, they have information about preparing and planning your disaster recovery services by assessing likely needs and building partnerships within the community. So again, going back to that coalition piece that we're trying to develop with CLearn. And then lastly, and most importantly, of course, is preparing your clients by teaching disaster preparedness information. And so with all this, basically HUD is targeting different housing counseling agencies, intermediaries, state housing finance agencies. But in actuality, this toolkit is super useful for anyone who just wants to be an active and effective role within the disaster recovery stage. And so again, within this toolkit, it offers different types of counseling programs and information, not counseling programs, but information for different counseling programs. And it's super, super informative and super, super dense. So we're going to go through just a little bit about it, and then we can scroll through the website together and take a look at it. But when we talk about our clients and the people that we're serving, it's important to kind of remember where things went wrong and learn from some huge issues in the past. And so when we think about Katrina, many, many, many people, of course, lost a lot of things, but within that, their medical records and different type of documentations that were needed after the fact in order to prove that they live somewhere or to prove that they have certain conditions, which is terrible. You're already going through something and have to basically make someone believe you, but this is what happens. And so basically this HUD toolkit goes through how to go through different preparation stages, including organizing your documents and templates, organizing your documents, and they have that in a template. So basically, one of the pages within the toolkit talks about how to take inventory of the types of documents that you need to have on file, whether it's something that's financial, whether again, it's your policy, proof of residency, so having your utility statements and whatnot, having all of that information stored away. Again, going back to something I mentioned earlier, having photographs or some kind of proof that the things you have in your home actually existed at some point. Keeping cash, potentially, and just making sure that anything that you have that is reminiscent of your history and your past. You want to keep for many reasons protected. So again, it focuses on preparing your property, preparing and maintaining the documents that you have that are associated with your property, and then of course preparing to leave your property. And so one of the biggest things when it comes to like filing for that additional funding or government support is, again, having the proof. If I cannot say anything more about insurance and about filing claims, is making sure you have the documentation. It seems like a super tedious thing to do when you're like in the middle of a work week and you're not really thinking about making your evacuation plan, and you're not really thinking about what may happen, but just putting it away in a gallon bag, storing it in the cabinet above the refrigerator or wherever, and just leaving it there once a year, just every year on June 1st, making sure you have all these documents printed and put in a gallon bag. It'll save a lot of trouble in the end. And so additionally, when we talk about or think about clients, there is a counseling portion within the toolkit, just around framing conversations that you may have, whether it is financial or whether it is like infrastructure related. They kind of map out the type of conversations that you may be able to have and potential solutions and responses to those problems that may arise when you talk to your clients. So this is, again, super useful for those who are working directly with clients or may even be a caretaker to someone or are, again, working with people face to face. If you all may feel like you're not the person to necessarily have those conversations, there are different housing counseling agencies that can help. So there is basically a search tool on HUD.gov that you can go to kind of check out the different types of housing counselors within your area. And then, of course, there's always a Super 800 number that you can call and talk to about those additional issues. And then, of course, with technology, there's a HUD counseling locator. I haven't used the app, but I've definitely used the online search tool, which is super helpful. But it's definitely worth checking out and seeing if it's useful to your clients. And so within the toolkit, they talk about when is the appropriate time to make arrangements. And so, of course, when we get around June, we start having a lot more conversations around preparedness, and we start having a lot more conversations around what to do in case of an emergency. But then there comes the impact, or there comes the warning. So those are generally your times where you want to stock supplies and get your information together, and knowing, what to do around your utilities. But again, the more that you can do upfront, so when you create your household emergency plan, that may also be a great time to gather your important household documents. You don't necessarily have to do things in a super responsive condition. The more prepared you can be ahead of time is the best way to be. So within the HUD toolkit, they've identified areas where agencies will need to be able to balance preparedness with their clients with the daily functions of their actual organization, the facilities that they maintain, and their staff. So when we talk about preparedness, of course, in the context of C-Learn, we talk a lot about interacting with your clients, but especially for administrators out there, it is also something to consider with your staff and the facilities that you operate under, and the operation systems that are guided by your organization. So those are also things that are super, super important, and is also covered within Toolkit. So I'm going to switch the screen really quickly, and we can take a look at some of the things that are offered in the HUD Toolkit. So this is the main site, again, HUDexchange.info, and I can put this link on the back end so you guys can access this where you're accessing the webinar itself. But again, we talk about who this is for, and then we go into the actual toolkit. So this first one is more so around the organization's preparedness. So it has some emergency response plans that you can basically build out for your organization in a continuity of operations plan that is here, or a template rather. And it kind of gives you a framework of which to operate under as basically a guideline. and this is super cool. Very simple, but also very important, is developing a phone tree. That way, if something happens, within your organization, everybody can get contacted by the appropriate means and not kind of just waiting around for the word from someone. So that's on an organization level. And then again, on the community level, they have different types of tools that you can use. If you are doing more community planning, neighborhood planning around how to build and prepare for these disasters around housing. And then, of course, client preparedness. So these may be of most use when we talk about CLearn stuff. And again, I'll put links of all this stuff on the website, so you don't really have to go through all of this. But they have a bunch of different tools that are pretty much, they're comprehensive, but they're also very much so laid out in language, so they don't use a bunch of vernacular that's unnecessary. And they go through terminology, especially when we think about tornado warnings versus tornado watches. So having this information ready for your clients is also super, super helpful. So it's very detailed. A lot of the information is very similar, if not redundant, from your typical Louisiana Emergency Preparedness Plan, information you'll get from NOLA.ready.gov. But again, having information is more useful than not having it. And so this sheet in particular was a fact sheet for home and family preparedness, but there's an additional one for basic home maintenance, which a lot of people kind of wait for last minute for. So this may be something to cover with clients maybe as soon as hurricane season starts, but it gives information around different types of disasters and not just hurricanes and flooding. And again, before the disaster and after disaster. And then lastly, this is one of the snapshots we saw in a couple slides ago, but kind of a checklist for clients and counselors to go through together. So going through with them, have they taken inventory of their important documents? Have they put their things on a flash drive but they refuse to print it out? Do you have home insurance coverage? Do you have flood insurance coverage? These are things that you can talk to your clients about, or again, you can always call that 800 number and maybe facilitate a conversation with your client, with a housing agency, or again, looking through the app and trying to find a physical location for you to go to talk with them about your client's needs. And so this is, again, is the HUD housing toolkit. So let's switch back. All right. So a lot of the community toolkit related things and within the HUD site that we just looked over talk a lot about community building and community preparedness. But when we think about that, it always makes me go back to CLearn. And so one of the focuses that we're looking for is that coalition piece, because when trouble hits, your neighbors and the people you're surrounded by are the main folks who are going to help you. If the community is strong to begin with, it's going to alleviate a lot of issues in the end. And so coalition building, it offers like the opportunity to holistically address housing issues post-disaster, but not even really housing issues, but many issues, whether it be housing, financial, or whatnot. So going back through the toolkit that they offer, some additional ways that not just housing authorities can be of use. So it talks about whether you're a realtor or a lender, whether you run different types of organizations that support housing programs and shelters, if you're in a food program and give out food for those who are in the needy, whether it's a faith-based institution, healthcare providers, mental health care services, hospitals, there's a role for everybody to play when it comes to preparedness and relative to housing especially, but in general, having that coalition aspect where people from different sectors can come together and collaborate for the best of the people within the area is the best way to go. So making use of this toolkit, I think it's pretty useful and it's going to be pretty intuitive, but holistic preparedness, response, and recovery is a primary focus of the toolkit. So before the use, you may want to analyze and develop an understanding of your agency's capacity to address housing issues. So if you're not a housing organization, for example, what is your role within this scope? And then, of course, afterwards, developing relationships and partnerships with agencies that manage housing and coalition building as a goal. And then, of course, they have a many of materials basically focused on agency and development and client outreach, whether it is researching local agencies to participate and help facilitate issues within an active disaster, or supportive housing services, or even creating and disseminating information across different disaster continuums. And so this last slide is just kind of a way for us to kind of put that communication chain from different organizations, or even within the same organization, into context. And so I mentioned earlier, just a phone tree, a simple phone tree is super, super useful. It's kind of a way to make sure that everyone is accounted for in the event that something happens. But also this can work within a community. It doesn't necessarily have to be an organization. So if your street wanted to put together a phone tree to make this kind of information go through basically a process, is totally optional and heavily recommended in many situations. And so again, I'm going to switch my screen just for a second and show you all some of the flood maps that have been used to kind of basically adopt flood insurance rates and whatnot in zones. So this is the LSU Ag Center. I believe we covered this in one of our previous disaster modules, but basically you can put in your address. And again, I'll put in my work address. Oh, can't spell today. Right. Oh, how about put in my zip code and address? And so it basically tells me what my risk is within where the address is. And so for, of course, this particular zone, the ground elevation is -2. And so you can go through what this means, and they'll basically tell you what your flood risk is and, you know, important action steps to take for that particular property. But this is also how people indicate their risk for flood. So interesting tool to use. It's definitely worth checking out, just kind of going through it and seeing how it works, putting in your home address, your family's address, just to kind of get a gauge of what's happening there. And then within those mapping tools came out some ways for homeowners to kind of, again, lower their risk. Now, these two guides are very informative, but they're also very much so financially dependent. So this first one is a homeowner's guide to retrofitting your home. So if you're already in a situation where money is limited, time is limited, access to resources is limited, this may not be the best guide for your clients, but you know, nonetheless, it's a resource out there. So it talks about ways for you to retrofit your home, whether it's raising the elevation or putting in different types of systems to make your home more sustainable. So it talks about like your foundation system, doing different types of inspections, all that jazz. So it's very much so built infrastructural based. And again, it may not be the best tool for someone who is already financially strapped, but it's something that is out there if that becomes an option. And then lastly, there is the Louisiana Homeowners Handbook to prepare for natural disasters, or natural hazards, which should probably be renamed. But this basically tells you some things that you can do to your home in order to make it more sustainable as far as disasters are concerned, which is similar to the retrofitting guide, but a little bit more layman's work. So again, super useful tool. May not be the best for someone who is already in a sticky situation, but it's best to have the information that's not. It also goes through different types of information around that, the categories for storms and things of that nature. Just when you're trying to put your mindset in a certain space to deal with certain issues, it's good to have some background context to what has happened before and just get some general definitions and terms. So again, these resources will be on the site where you guys are accessing the webinars, just so we can kind of keep everything in one place. So thank you guys for joining me today. It was my pleasure. And we will continue on tomorrow for our last mental health session, which is on, I believe it's medication management. So You guys take care, and I will chat with you tomorrow.